Hey, campfire crew, let's get it on. We Thought He Was a Jerk, submitted by Hunky Dory Hank. I don't know how scary people will think this is, but it was pretty creepy when it happened. When I was a kid and up into middle school, my parents always sent me to a camp that was sort of affiliated with my church. It was a really cool place, and I looked forward to that week I got to spend there with friends, and some friends I only saw in summer at that camp. When I was in 7th grade, however, the camp stopped their middle school program, and my church decided to go to another one in an adjoining state. Some of the same people went, but there would also be a lot more different people from a lot of different places in a camp much bigger. I decided I'd give it a whirl, and it would kind of change my life and how I see people. At first, I hated it. I didn't like the way it was run, I didn't like the counselors, and I certainly didn't like my cabin counselor, Bob. From the get-go, Bob came off as a total dick. He was in his early 20s, built like a football player, and I later found out that he was a football player. But he was working on some theology degree, which amazed me because of how gruff and negative he seemed. Plus, the mouth on Bob didn't sound like someone who was going to go into ministry. Even on the day all my cabin mates arrived, he was just a miserable guy. I figured, well, we're only in the cabin at night, and I wouldn't have to see or deal with Bob other than activities that were cabin-based, like competitions and stuff. But it didn't change the fact that he was still around and just a dick. I talked to all the guys in my cabin, and they agreed that he was not what they were expecting at a religious camp. He was very strict about the rules of our cabin, actually had us do calisthenics when we woke up, and often lectured us about working out and keeping our bodies in shape and learning to protect ourselves. We didn't know why, and he didn't do it in a fun way. It was more like a military school. I looked forward to every minute I wasn't around Bob, and he seemed to be liked by all the other camp staff, but he was just who he was, I suppose. I would learn exactly who he was during my week at that camp. On the second night we were in the cabin, he told us he wanted the lights out at 10, when all of the other cabins were allowed to stay up until 11. We had to do an evening devotional, and then he wanted lights out. And then he would leave the cabin with us barricaded in. This was probably a liability now that I look back at it, because if one of us had to go to the bathroom but couldn't get out and had to wait for Bob to come back, that would have been bad. That never happened. But then I thought, what if something else terrible happened, like a fire? Again, it didn't happen, but it was odd that Bob would lock us in the cabin for an hour or two before coming back. We all talked about what Bob was up to, but none of us said anything to anybody else at the camp. I think we all just wanted to enjoy the other activities and not stir the pot and possibly bring on the wrath of Bob. One day during free time, my friend I'll call Kevin and I were kind of just exploring the camp. There was a big creek that ran on one border of the camp with some other trails alongside it. I think we knew that we were supposed to be supervised if we went out there, but Kevin and I took off on our own and were just checking things out. Honestly, I think we were looking for places to sneak out and hang out if we could get around the watchful eye of Bob. We found this cool little trail that didn't look like it was walked on that much that led to an open spot right next to the creek. It did look like other people had camped there or did camp there at some point, but the trail to get to it was faint. Kevin happened to see it, and that's why we followed it. So we were just sitting there on a log looking at the creek and talking about how this would be a cool place to hang out. And it made me want to bring some of the other guys out there when we heard a rustling coming down the trail. There was nowhere to run for us unless we went right into the creek, and we didn't want to do that. There were a lot of sharp rocks down there. But someone was definitely coming down the trail, and it turned out to be another counselor named Steve. He had a 6th grade camper with him and was surprised to see us. "Oh, hi, guys," he said. "What are you guys doing out here?" We just told him that we were walking around and found this place. We could tell that Steve was kind of annoyed. I remember the name of the kid, but I'm going to change it for this story. I'm going to call him Jay. I wouldn't want to use his real name in this. Jay had a look on his face like he didn't want to be there. I asked him how he liked camp so far, and he just kind of half smiled. Steve picked up on that and said, "No, Jay, you really like it here, don't you?" And he kind of bumped Jay's shoulder with his hand. Jay didn't say anything. The whole thing was really awkward, and Kevin and I were kind of saying how we were just going to leave, but Steve asked us to stay and said he was going to tell some stories. We said we weren't really down with that, and we wanted to go swimming, so we were going to go back to the main camp area. For some reason, Kevin asked Jay if he wanted to come with us, and Jay sort of looked at Steve, and Steve said, "You can go if you want, but I thought we were going to hunt for crayfish in the creek. Don't you want to do that?" Jay looked back at us and said he'd rather go swimming. Steve looked irritated and said, "Okay, just go back with these guys then." Again, the whole thing was just so off and weird. We started back on the trail and asked Jay more questions about how he was liking camp, but he was very, very shy. Steve didn't follow us, and then it dawned on me that at first he said he was going to tell some stories about nature, and then he changed it to they were going to look for crayfish. It seemed weird to me that his story changed that quick. Anyway, we were still on the main trail going back to camp when out of nowhere popped Bob. There he was in all of his 6'4" linebacker profile. As I mentioned, Bob was a big guy, and he roared at us, "What the hell are you guys doing out here?" We didn't know what to say. We had never heard anyone talk like this at church camp. And he looked at me and Kevin and said, "God damn it, I expect this stuff from other campers, but not guys from my cabin. Get your asses back to camp." Not once did he smile or say anything else. He just told us that we had to get our asses back to the main camp and to not wander back here by ourselves. Then he just gave us one more bad look and started walking down the trail. We did what we were told and hauled ass back to camp and decided to just go swimming before lunch while bad-mouthing Bob the entire time. I mean, what a jerk. Some other guys were in our cabin getting ready to go swimming too, and we told them what had happened and how much of an asshole Bob was. And they said that he had left the cabin when they'd told him that Kevin and I had gone exploring on the trails. They said he just ran out immediately and said he would meet us at the pool. My friend Chris said Bob was very pissed off about us doing what we did. Oh well, we thought, let's just go swimming. And we did. That night Bob did his evening thing by barricading us in and not coming back for an hour and a half. Around 11:30 he did come in, and all of us had turned our flashlights off real quick so as to not make him mad. He just got on his bunk and went to sleep. The next day, Kevin, Chris, and another friend, Rob, all decided that we were going to jump out of one of the windows and follow Bob to see exactly what he was doing at night. It was about an 8 or 10 foot drop from the window, but we figured if we hung from the sill, it wouldn't be that far. Getting back in would be a different thing, I pointed out, but we decided to take the chance. I mean, what was this guy Bob all about? We wanted to find out. That night, Bob did his thing. When he was gone, we opened a window while the rest of the cabin guys were telling us not to do it and we were going to get everyone in trouble. We still went. We didn't even know where to go, and Kevin suggested we go down the trails to see if he was down there. Kevin had this crazy theory that Bob had some kind of stash of drug or booze that he didn't want anyone to find, and that's why we got yelled at the other day, because he thought we were snooping for it. At the time, it was just a theory, but that's what Kevin thought. We sneaked by all the other cabins quietly and made our way across the big soccer field to the trees where the trail started. We were walking in the dark with just one flashlight, trying to be quiet and keeping our eyes peeled for Bob or any other shenanigans. We were so spooked, we kept hearing all kinds of natural noises, thinking it was something other than what it was, but also thinking that Bob was around every turn. That's when Kevin said, "Hey, let's go to that secret spot we were at the other day. Maybe that's where Bob is." We agreed, and we all made our way there. We were being super quiet to make sure that we could sneak up on anyone that was there. And there was someone there. Someone was in a sleeping bag on the ground, and we could hear whimpering. We didn't really know what to think of it. But then we saw Jay crawl out of the sleeping bag and say, "I don't like that. Please stop. I won't tell anyone, but I don't like that." Then we heard the voice of Steve saying something we couldn't make out. But then we heard him clearly say, "I can make the rest of your camp experience a living hell if you don't get back in the sleeping bag." We all stopped and looked at each other. I mean, sure, we were pretty young, maybe 12 years old, but we all knew what the hell was going on at that point. And that's when we got bowled over from behind. It was Bob. He blasted past us without a word, and before Jay could get near the sleeping bag again, Bob picked it up with one arm. The dude was strong as hell. Steve was in the sleeping bag, and Bob started screaming at him. He was calling him all kinds of names and said, "I knew I would catch you, you slimy fucker," and stuff like that. He was yelling a bunch of other things about how he was going to see to it that he never did this kind of thing ever again. Steve was just trapped inside the sleeping bag, screaming for help. Bob put the bag down on the ground and threatened to throw Steve into the rocky creek if he didn't shut up. Then he shut the top of the bag with the cord that was on it and turned around and looked at us. Bob's face was no longer mad in our flashlight. It was compassionate. It was full of love. He said in a soft voice, "You boys go back to the main office of camp. Make sure that Jay gets there okay with you. Run as fast as you can. I'll be right behind you." We did as he said and ran as fast as we could in the dark back to the main office and then sat on the porch. Rob said, "What do we do now?" And I said, "I don't know. Maybe we should knock on the door and wake up the camp director." We decided that we were going to do that as we saw Bob making his way across the soccer field, the sleeping bag slung over his shoulder. The camp director came out onto the porch just as Bob was coming up with Steve still stuffed in the bag and was yelling all kinds of stuff and threats towards Bob. But even as kids, we knew what was going on. Jay burst into tears and wouldn't stop crying, and we kept telling him that it was okay, everything was going to be fine. The camp director asked Bob what the heck he was doing, and Bob said, "I'd like to talk to you about this inside." And then he asked us to stay on the porch. We didn't hear the whole conversation, but the camp director then came out and asked us to come in. He had a lot of questions about why we were out running around at night, where we had gone, what we had seen, and we were all truthful in what we told him about finding Steve and Jay out at that secret spot. We told him what Jay had said and that he had been in the sleeping bag, about how he said he didn't like it. Jay was actually taken to the nurse's station during all of this and had a very different talk with the camp director and the nurse. Seeing as how I've gotten this far into the story, it doesn't take a genius to figure out that Bob had been spying and hunting Steve for a while. He had suspicions that Steve was abusing kids but could never catch him in the act. The police came out that night, took Steve away, and took Bob with them for a while too after talking to us. The camp director reminded the police that they couldn't really question us without our parents, but they picked up enough information to take them both away. The camp director went back to our cabin and slept in there with us that night. The next morning when we woke up, it was just another day. But not really. Our cabin mates were asking all about what had happened the night before, but the camp director had asked us to not say anything to them just yet. As we were getting ready to go to breakfast, our cabin door opened and in came Bob. Bob said, "Hey, you guys, hang on for a second. Everybody sit down on your bunks." He then sat down with his head in his hands, and he said he was going to say a quick prayer for the day. He said a lot about watching over us and keeping us safe and protecting us. And then he looked up at us with tears in his eyes and he said, "I know I've been a mean guy the last few days, and it's not your fault. I've been trying to find a bad person in this camp for the last 3 weeks, and it's made me an overprotective jerk. I was just worried about you boys, and I'm sorry for coming off like a mean guy." Of course, I asked him if he had found the guy he was looking for, and at first he didn't say anything as he looked at me. And then he kind of nodded his head and said, "That guy won't be hurting anybody anymore." Steve never came back to the camp. All of us in our cabin were notified of what was going on, and some of my friends in my cabin and other cabins' parents came and got them before our 2 weeks' days was up. For me, Kevin, and Rob, our parents came that day, and there was a lot more questions with the police involved. Some of the guys went home, most of them stayed, and parents usually came out on that Saturday night to have a big bonfire with us. When that day came, I noticed a lot of parents going over and talking to Bob. What happened was never addressed with the campers other than the fact that Steve was gone and another counselor came in to take his place. Of course, our parents talked to us a lot about what had happened and asked if we were okay or if we wanted to go home. I said I wanted to stay. They asked me if I liked my friends and my cabin counselor, Bob, and I said I like Bob a lot. Rob and Kevin felt the same way, too. The rest of the time we were there, it was just a regular camp and lots of fun. Turns out, Bob was a really great guy. He had a huge heart to go along with his huge football player muscles. Everything that we had been doing changed into fun activities, and he would take us on these cool nature walks. He would always organize sports games that were not normal church camp activities, that were super fun. And that year, he started the first huge capture the flag game that involved everybody in the camp. To this day, campers still play that game, and he even goes back to be the official capture the flag leader every year. He's now in his late 50s. After camp, I kept in touch with Bob well into my high school years, and one time he and his wife actually came to our church because they happened to be in town. That was the last time I saw him in person, and he was the same powerhouse guy as he was when I was little. Bob is still a pastor. He has 3 grown children and has spent his life dedicated to his church and youth ministries. As I finish writing this story down, I think I'm going to make it a point to give him a phone call if I can track him down. It's been a while since I've said hello. So thank you to Bob for taking care of us kids and watching out for us, even though you were a pretty scary guy the first time we met you. For a while you had us all terrified that you were trying to hurt us or something, when all the while you were protecting us. I will say this about Bob. I've never heard a pastor swear like Bob, and I'm certain he's cleaned it up since his early 20s. But some of the things that he said to us kids make me laugh now, and I think that in this day and age, he would have been the guy asked to leave camp for his crass language. Anyway, that's my story about summer camp, and one of the coolest people I've ever met in my life. It just goes to show you should never judge a book by its cover, and that there are really bad people out there in this world. But I'm also glad that there are people like Bob out there, keeping kids safe from predators. It Wasn't Security by Retrosonic82. This was the early 90s at a school camp. I got up during the night to go to the camp toilet. It wasn't far away, and I could see it from our tent. There wasn't anybody around. On my way back, I spotted a man I didn't recognize shining a torch into the side of the boys' tent to make shadows appear. When he saw me approach, he put his torch away and walked away, but was sort of hovering around the campsite. I thought he was campsite security and that I was going to get in trouble for leaving my tent during the night, and as I was an anxious kid, it kept me up all night. As I couldn't sleep, I noticed for a good hour or so that the guy was still walking around and shining his torch into the side of tents, and I could hear him and see the light. In the morning, I was falling asleep at breakfast, and my friends were taking the piss out of it. One of the teachers noticed and thought I was getting sick, so she came over to ask if I was all right, and I said I'd been up all night because of the camp security guard shining his torch into tents. She looked horrified and said, "What camp security?" and went off to tell one of the male teachers. It turned out that the campsite didn't have security, and the police were called out. Some guy who was known to the area for being a sex offender had recently been released from prison and was living in the nearby forest in a tent. Why They Took Us into the Woods by Atlantis Airlines. I was about 12 and I was at sleepaway camp, and the counselors took us on a hike into the woods for a night. When it came time to go to bed, of course, none of us were actually falling asleep, and we overheard the counselors talking about the police looking for someone. We later learned one of the kids was in the middle of a serious custody battle, and that the dad was planning on taking the kid, and that the reason we were in the woods was so that he wouldn't find us at the cabin. No idea if it was actually dangerous, but looking back, it definitely is unsettling. The Gorilla Suit by IBTG X43. My youth group stayed at a campsite for a weekend trip. We were all in the cabin playing card games when someone with a gorilla suit ran by the cabin and started banging on the door. It really freaked everyone out because it was no one in our group. They came back a couple of times until one of the adults confronted the person and they ran away. They never found out who the person was. How Did They Not Notice? By Narbutta. We were playing soccer and someone shattered my leg and broke it in 8 places. There was no swelling, so they said I was faking it and they wouldn't take me to the hospital. They sent me back to my cabin for the night. I hopped around for a day, but the next night I was in too much pain to sleep, so I limped off to the nurse's office, broke in and took a handful of Benadryl just so I could sleep. That night, a group was doing an overnight in a 3-sider shelter and decided to have a peanut butter fight before bed. One kid fell asleep with peanut butter in his hair and woke up when a skunk walked into the shelter and pulled a piece of his scalp out. The kid punted the skunk out of the shelter, which caused it to spray everyone on the overnight. So they had to take the kid for rabies shots, so they might as well take me along to get x-rays since they were going anyway. Helen Keller could have pointed out the breaks on my x-rays. Archery Mishap by Street Bitch. I went to a Boy Scout summer camp in the mid to late 90s. They had an archery range where we were all learning how to shoot. They were big on safety, but it was the 90s, so... Anyway, everyone shoots at that camp. And we were downrange getting our arrows when we heard someone yell out in the covered shooting area. I looked up and saw one of the semi-special needs kids holding an arrow at full draw, and he let it go. It hit the kid standing 5 feet from me in the arm. It was chaos, with everyone running around and screaming. The kid with an arrow stuck out of him was just standing there in shock. The following year, there was no more archery training. Out in the Wilderness by Gozer de Gazarian. We were on this really long canoe trip in northern Ontario, like deep wilderness. We were on this gorgeous clear lake when we found a secluded beach, and it was really beautiful, so we decided to stay there for the night. The whole day and even sitting around the fire that night felt weird, but I couldn't really place my finger on it. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of soft country music, but none of us had a stereo, so I stuck my head out of the tent to see what the fuck was up. There was a bald guy going through our campsite, picking up stuff as he went along. We made eye contact, and he put a finger to his lips and made a shh sound. So I just hid in my sleeping bag. I can't remember what he took, but it wasn't much. But it turns out there's a pretty significant hermit population in northern Ontario. Ghostly Suicide by Blah Blah Tra-la-la-la-la. I was in a summer camp on an island when I was 13, and we were hanging out at the beach during dawn. All of a sudden, a woman came out of nowhere and walked with big steps towards the water. She'd been wearing a white cape which she threw dramatically away, and underneath she was completely naked. When she reached the water, she walked into it, despite it not being very warm. And then she started to swim, always straight ahead away from the island until we lost track of her. We were there for more than an hour and a half, but she never came back, and it was dark then. She was naked and her cape was still on the beach. Back then we joked that she was a mermaid, but it later occurred to me that we may have witnessed a suicide. Creepers by Jay Stanacki. When I was 14 and just about to turn 15, I went to the confirmation camp. This place was located in the middle of literally nothing, just endless forest around us. There were a total of about maybe 30 of us. teenagers like me, and then the camp leaders. The cottage was 2 floors high, and on the second floor was the girls' bedrooms. We were settled down to sleep one night, and it was probably around midnight, when suddenly there was a really loud banging on the only window the room had. Since it was already dark outside at this time, I couldn't really see what, or rather who it was, until the person turned a flashlight on. The light was going through the room, and we were able to see 2 grown-up men, probably around 30 years old, lurking on us and smiling. Thanks to the people who built this place, the window couldn't be opened and wouldn't fit a person through it anyway. The leaders, of course, heard the screams and voices and called the police, but the men had enough time to escape before the authorities made it there. In the morning, while discussing the events of the past night, it turned out that one of the girls in the camp was actually having some kind of relationship with one of these men. Yeah, illegal much? She'd invited them. The police did go and have a chat with these men, but they never got anything out of it since they didn't do anything illegal enough. It still was very creepy to wake up to grown men randomly searching around looking at young girls while they're sleeping. On the second floor. I should say there was a fire escape under the window, but it's still creepy. Camp Negatively Changed Me by Sober DWTX. I was 15 years old at a summer camp in upstate New York. One of the older counselors, maybe around 22 or older, I think, cornered me in a dark cleaning supply closet one afternoon. He started kissing me and grinding on me while grabbing my ass and pulling me into him. It lasted about 20 seconds, but I still remember it to this day like it was yesterday. Another older male counselor had a bunch of 9-year-olds hold me down and grab me all over. It was terrifying. I went home after that summer a different person. I left home 9 months later at the age of 16, and it wasn't because of that specifically, but after being molested by my grandfather from age 3 to 9, and then a couple of guys at a summer camp, I kind of lost faith in my parents' ability to protect me. Ghosts by Grabow. During the summers, I would spend a month or so visiting family in Michigan. Some of my cousins my age would go to a camp in the Upper Peninsula called Hiawatha. The cabins we got assigned for the week had about 6 campers and 2 counselors and were spaced far apart from each other deep in the woods, away from the common area. There were stories about a father and son that were hunting near the campgrounds during the off-season. The story went that the father thought he saw a big buck and took a shot at it, only to get to the deer and find out he had shot his son in the neck. Being so deep in the woods, and with such a fatal shot, he shot his son in the head to stop the pain. The game and wildlife agents that found them said the father then suffered an apparent gunshot wound through the roof of his mouth or of his head in what looked like a murder-suicide. The counselors always felt it necessary to tell the story to the younger and new campers. Now, I don't know if hearing the story and the atmosphere of cabins being so far from the common areas and deep in the woods caused me to see things. But a friend and I were walking from the cabins to the mess hall early one morning before the breakfast bell, and we saw what looked like a father and son dressed like they were hunting and carrying shotguns, walking towards our cabin. Ours was almost second for being the farthest from anything. We took off so fast sprinting through the trees. Once we hit the open field between the cabins and the mess hall, we saw another group of guys running behind us. We were shocked to see anyone else before the bell rang, and running no less. We asked them why they were running too, and they looked back from the direction they came, turned to us and said, "We just saw a hunter, pointing a shotgun at us." Serial Rapist by Nashville Sun. I went to a popular Christian faith-based sports camp for several summers as a kid. When I was 12, one of my cabin counselors turned out to be the most popular and beloved leader at camp. He was inclusive, energetic, and fun. He gave just as much attention to the cool and popular kids as he did the outcasts. Randomly, He went to the same university as my older brother and my best friend's older sisters, so that kind of created a connection with our families. He also happened to be romantically involved at the time with an up-and-coming singer who lived in our hometown. For a couple of years after we first got to know him at camp, he would visit my family and my friend's family for long weekends. By that time, I was over camp. I never enjoyed playing sports, and that's the only thing that camp had to offer. But this guy would give me and my friend a hard time about bailing on camp and not writing him with any reliable frequency. By the time I finished junior high, that relationship had fallen by the wayside. Anyway, about 10 years ago, this guy was arrested and convicted for being a serial child abuser. His MO? Make the victims feel special and get close to their family. So far, almost 60 victims have come forward. One sadly committed suicide in 2019. The camp leadership knew pretty much the entire time what was going on and did everything they could to keep the authorities out of it. Apparently he tried, but I was lucky enough to never be one of his victims. He's currently serving 2 life sentences plus 30 years in prison. Testing the Waters by Zap 2. I was on a canoe trip, and it was a trip that had been done by this camp for 10 to 20 years. The canoeing always was in the same portion of a pretty well-known river. Every year on the first day of the canoe trip, kids and staff members would jump off this rock on the edge of the river. It was probably 20 feet up in the air, but the water was deep, probably something like 10 or 12 feet of water. This group of kids asked to make the jump just as thousands of kids had done before. We tested it out by having the tallest staff member jump off of it. He safely did so then the kids went and did the same. Several kids jumped, came up, and were all fine. Then one kid jumped, came up, and said, "I think I cut my knee." Everyone laughed, but then this kid said, "No, seriously, come and look at it." There was a giant chunk of fat around his knee missing. I mean, if the injury had been anywhere elsewhere, it would be pumping out blood. While it could have been worse, the kid was fine. He went to the hospital and got 12 or so stitches. He didn't rejoin the trip, but he went back and stayed the 2 weeks at camp. Needless to say, no kid ever jumped off that giant rock again. Hey gang, thanks for listening to this episode of Uncle Josh's True Scary Stories. If you have a true scary story of any nature that you'd like to hear narrated on my podcast or this channel, email it to unclejoshtruescarystories@gmail.com. I read them all. I know this format is a little bit different, and I didn't get a lot of subscriber stories about summer camp, except the one that I did that you've heard here about Bob. But I wanted to share some other cool ones I found. I hope you enjoyed it. I can't remember which episode it was when I talked about some of my summer camp experiences, because I had a lot of really good ones, and a lot of funny stuff that happened that did involve some creepy stuff too. I suggest you listen to all my episodes and go back and find which one that was in. I do remember a funny one about a story that we used to tell about Scarface, and that one always hits home with me in the summer because one of the kids that was involved in that, who was my age at the time, unfortunately was hit by a car while he was serving in the military, and he died at the age of 20. And the counselor that was involved in the hijinks about Scarface that actually scared the other kid took his life about 12 years ago. So, summertime, I always think of those two guys, both of them no longer with us. Rest in peace, guys. If you haven't already, please like, share, and subscribe to my channel. Make sure you hit the notification button for every time that I upload. Follow me on social media. All the links to that are in the description below. And if you'd like to support this channel in any way that you can, find me on Patreon. A link to that is in the description, as is a direct link to my store on tpublic.com. Grab yourself some Campfire Crew merch. More designs are coming for that as well. Everyone, be excellent to each other. And until next time, be wary of things that go bump in the night. It could be anything. A ghost, a monster, or the guy next door.